The desert night lit up like daytime. It wasn't sunrise. It wasn't lightning. It was the sky flashing with distant explosions and streaks of bright light as jets roared overhead. On television screens in the United States, people stared in silence. Some held their breath. Some whispered, "This is real." A reporter's voice shook as he spoke from far away. Behind him, the horizon glowed. And then the words came across the broadcast that made everything feel final. The war has begun. This was the Gulf War. And what shocked the world most was how fast it moved. The United States had prepared for months, building the largest military force seen in the region in decades. Then, when the moment came, the first major attacks happened so quickly and so strongly that many people watching felt like history was speeding up. Here's the cliffhanger. As the cameras rolled and the sky burned with light, U.S. leaders knew they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. But the most dangerous part was still ahead. Because everyone asked the same scary question. If this war is moving this fast, what happens next? Now, let's go back to the beginning. Before the bright sky, before the countdown, before the world learned a new name, Operation Desert Storm. It started with a place far from most American homes, the Persian Gulf region. This area mattered to the whole world because it was tied to global oil supplies and trade routes. When trouble happened there, it could affect prices, politics, and safety everywhere. In 1990, a serious crisis began when Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait. Kuwait was a small country with major oil resources. The invasion shocked many nations. People feared it could lead to more attacks on neighboring countries. It also made the world worry about control of oil and power in the region. The United States and many other countries demanded that Iraq leave Kuwait. The United Nations got involved. Leaders held meetings. Messages were sent back and forth. Deadlines were set. But Iraq did not leave. So the world began forming a coalition, many countries working together. The goal was clear: force Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. In the United States, President George H.W. Bush spoke to the nation. He explained that this wasn't just about one small country. He said it was about stopping aggression and protecting global stability. He talked about a new world order, meaning a world where countries would not be allowed to simply take land by force. Meanwhile, the U.S. military began moving a massive number of troops, vehicles, and equipment to the Middle East. This was called Operation Desert Shield at first because it began as a defensive effort to protect Saudi Arabia and prepare for what might come next. For months, American families watched the news. They saw pictures of desert camps. They saw soldiers writing letters home. They saw long lines of tanks and trucks rolling across sand. Some people supported the mission strongly. Others worried about the cost and the risk. Many simply felt nervous, because war is always scary, especially when you know real people who may be sent into danger. At the same time, leaders tried one last path: diplomacy. The United Nations gave Iraq a final deadline to leave Kuwait. The date became a ticking clock that the world could not ignore. As the deadline got closer, military planners worked day and night. They studied maps. They studied weather. They planned routes and timing. They prepared for a conflict that might be quick or might drag on for a long time. No one truly knew. That uncertainty is what made it so tense. Then the deadline passed. Iraq still did not leave Kuwait, and the coalition decided it was time. The next phase was given a name that sounded like it belonged in a movie: Operation Desert Storm. But it was not a movie. On the night it began, air attacks started. On American television, people watched green-tinted footage that looked strange and unreal. It was like seeing history through night vision goggles. Reporters described sirens, darkness, and sudden flashes. In the U.S., some people stayed up late, changing channels trying to understand what was happening. Some children asked their parents questions like, "Are we safe?" Parents tried to answer calmly, even when they felt afraid too. The first stage of the war was built around speed and pressure. The goal was to weaken Iraq's ability to fight and to force a withdrawal from Kuwait. Coalition leaders wanted to move fast and avoid a long, drawn-out war. But war never follows a perfect plan. Even when leaders say something will be quick, it can still become complicated in ways nobody expects. In the desert, the ground was harsh. The air was dry. The distances were huge. And both sides were preparing for a major ground battle. The United States had advanced technology, strong planning, and a large coalition behind it. But Iraq had a large army in the region and had been preparing defenses. So while the air campaign continued, soldiers on the ground waited. And waiting can be one of the hardest parts. You hear rumors. You imagine worst-case situations. You think about home. You think about what could happen next. This is the low part of the story, quiet hours before a storm. Then, as days passed, everyone started hearing the same phrase again and again. The ground war is coming. People knew that once ground forces moved in, everything would change quickly. That would be the true test. As the air campaign shook the night sky, coalition commanders gave a new order. Troops began moving into position for the next phase. Radios crackled. Engines started. The desert, once still, began to rumble. The ground war was about to begin. The desert felt strangely quiet before the ground war began. Not quiet like a normal night. Quiet like the moment before a big storm. Soldiers sat in vehicles with their helmets on, waiting for orders. Some checked their gear again and again. Some stared into the dark, thinking about home. Some tried to sleep but couldn't. In the United States, families watched the news and tried to understand what was happening. They saw maps on TV with arrows and lines. They heard words like coalition, front lines, and ground assault. But even adults didn't fully know what the next days would look like. Because once the ground war started, it could become fast, messy, and unpredictable. This was the low part, waiting and fear. Then came the high, extreme moment. On February 24, 1991, the ground war began. Coalition forces moved in quickly. Huge columns of vehicles rolled across the desert. The sound of engines and trucks filled the air. Dust rose behind them like clouds. The plan was built around speed and surprise. Coalition forces didn't just push straight forward. They moved wide and fast, trying to outsmart Iraqi defenses. They wanted to avoid long fighting and force Iraqi units to retreat. And it worked faster than many expected. In a short time, the coalition broke through key areas and captured many positions. Iraqi soldiers began surrendering in large numbers. Some were exhausted and hungry. Some looked confused. Many seemed like they didn't want to keep fighting. On American TV, reporters described it as a rapid collapse of Iraq's defenses in certain areas. People at home were shocked. They had expected a long battle. Instead, it was moving like a powerful wave. But even in a fast war, danger remained everywhere. The desert is not easy. Sandstorms can reduce visibility. Vehicles can break down. Navigation can go wrong. And in war, a mistake can cost lives. There were also dangers from burning oil fields in Kuwait. Thick black smoke rose into the sky. The air looked dark and heavy. The smoke made the region look like it was under a shadow. People watching at home saw the black clouds and felt sick. It looked like the world was on fire. Meanwhile, coalition leaders had two main goals: push Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, end the war quickly. But they also wanted to avoid huge losses, and they wanted to prevent the conflict from spreading further. As ground forces advanced, coalition troops entered Kuwait. They found evidence of damage and destruction left behind. Buildings were harmed. Roads were torn up. Oil wells were burning. This made the mission feel even more serious. It wasn't just about a battlefield. It was about a country that had been invaded. Then came another extreme moment that the world still talks about. As Iraqi forces retreated, there were scenes of chaos on the roads out of Kuwait, long lines of vehicles and equipment trying to escape. Coalition aircraft attacked some of these columns. Later, these scenes became part of how people remembered the war's speed and power. It was a grim reminder that even a fast war can be brutal. Back in the United States, emotions were mixed. Some people felt relief that the war seemed to be ending quickly. Some worried about what would happen next in the Middle East. Some simply felt numb, watching night vision footage, and thinking about the reality behind it. And leaders were still making high-stakes decisions. Because even when you are winning, you can still make a mistake that turns victory into disaster. Coalition forces had pushed Iraq out of Kuwait, but the question became, do we stop here? Or do we keep going? Some wanted to push all the way into Iraq and remove Saddam Hussein. Others warned that could turn a short war into a long occupation and create more instability. President Bush and coalition leaders focused on the original mission, liberate Kuwait. And because the mission had been achieved so quickly, they prepared to end the fighting. But war doesn't always end cleanly. There are always moments that make people wonder if the peace will hold. This is where tension rises again. As forces moved and orders changed, confusion was possible. Small clashes could still happen. Mistakes could still happen. Someone could still fire when they shouldn't. And the world was still watching. After only about 100 hours of ground combat, coalition leaders announced that a ceasefire was coming. The war that had built up for months was about to stop. But one final question hung in the air like smoke. Would everyone actually stop fighting? Or would the last hours become the most dangerous of all? The order came quickly. After months of build-up and only days of fighting on the ground, coalition leaders announced a ceasefire. The word spread fast across the desert through radios and command centers. Stop advancing. Hold positions. For many soldiers, it felt unreal. They had trained for a long war. They had prepared for weeks or months of hard fighting. And now, after about 100 hours of ground combat, it was ending. But even when leaders say a war is over, the danger does not disappear instantly. In the desert, units slowed down carefully. Soldiers stayed alert. Weapons were still loaded. No one wanted to relax too soon. Because history has shown that the last moments of a war can be some of the most dangerous. Some Iraqi units were still moving. Some were confused. Some did not immediately know the fighting had stopped. Communication in war is never perfect. Coalition commanders worked to make sure orders were clear. They wanted to avoid accidents. They wanted to end the conflict without more loss. Slowly, the guns went quiet. The desert, once filled with noise and movement, became still again. In Kuwait, people began to come out into the streets. Some cried. Some waved flags. Some hugged strangers. After months of fear and occupation, they were free. But the land showed scars. Burning oil wells continued to send thick black smoke into the sky. The air smelled heavy. The ground was damaged. The cleanup would take years. Back in the United States, President George H.W. Bush spoke to the nation. He said the mission had been accomplished. Kuwait had been liberated. Coalition forces had achieved their goals. Many Americans felt relief. Parents hugged their children tighter. Families waited for loved ones to come home. Yellow ribbons stayed tied to trees, but now they felt hopeful instead of fearful. The Gulf War quickly became known as one of America's fastest wars. People were surprised by how quickly it ended, especially after so much buildup and tension. Military experts studied it closely. They talked about technology, planning, and coordination. Night vision cameras, precision weapons, real-time communication. All of it made the war feel different from past conflicts. But speed did not erase the cost. Soldiers returned home carrying memories they would never forget. Some struggled with what they had seen. Some had injuries that would last a lifetime. Some felt proud, while others felt uneasy about how quickly life had changed. The war also left questions behind. Saddam Hussein was still in power in Iraq. Tensions in the region did not disappear. New conflicts would rise in the years ahead. The Gulf War solved one problem, but it did not end all problems. And that became one of its biggest lessons. Fast victories can still have long shadows. For Americans watching from home, the Gulf War changed how war was seen on television. It felt closer, more real, more immediate. People saw live reports from the battlefield. They saw maps update in real time. They saw explosions through green night vision lenses. War was no longer something read about days later in a newspaper. It was happening now. And that made it more powerful and more frightening. Today, historians look back at the Gulf War as a turning point. It showed how modern warfare could move at incredible speed. It showed how coalitions could work together. And it showed how quickly the world could go from tension to war to ceasefire. The Gulf War was not the longest war, but it was one of the fastest. And in those few intense weeks, it changed military history forever. Because it proved something important. In the modern world, decisions move fast. Wars move fast. And the consequences can last for generations. That is why the Gulf War is still remembered today, not just for how it began, but for how quickly it ended and for the lessons it left behind.